Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Jamie Ducharme. She is a staff writer for Time magazine covering health and science issues and is the author of a new book called Big Vape, The Incendiary Rise of Juul. I can't imagine there are too many people listening who don't know what JUUL is, but Jamie has become really an expert on the company, its meteoric rise, its domination of the e-cigarette market, and the many controversies surrounding the company, whether in fact it is a safe product or just not quite as cancer-causing as cigarettes, and other questions like how they've marketed JUUL, whether they are direct or some knowing targeting of young people. They have flavored JUUL pods like creme brulee and strawberry shortcake and things like that. You can decide for yourself. You're going to learn a lot, I know, hearing Jamie talk about the rise of JUUL and where we're going with the e-cigarette industry in terms of government regulation. The FDA is now looking at JUUL very closely. There have been lots of changes already in response to JUUL, such as a number of states raising the legal age to 21 for purchase of all tobacco products. So this is a very important area, one that certainly has a lot of public health implications. And if you know someone or you yourself have a child, even as young as a middle schooler, and you don't know a whole lot about JUUL, you're going to want to listen to this episode and learn about it, because chances are your middle school or high school kid knows a lot more about JUUL than you do. And of course, you're going to want to hear more about Jamie's new book, Big Vape. So stay tuned for this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome our guest today, Jamie Ducharme. She's a staff writer for Time magazine covering health and science and the author of really such an important and timely new book called Big Vape, The Incendiary Rise of Juul. So first of all, Jamie, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm super excited too. And as I mentioned to you before we got started, I've been following JUUL and interested in JUUL for some time, and I should disclose I have a tangential involvement in some of the litigation against JUUL in California, which is not the subject of our conversation today, but I did want to at least disclose that. I know you've been covering the rise and now troubles of JUUL for a number of years. I guess tell us about the book a little bit, and then I'm going to get right to it because I got a lot of questions for you about this.
Great. Yeah, so I'm a health writer at Time magazine. So I came to the JUUL story from the health and science, sort of lens. Around 2018, we started to hear just a lot about how many kids were using these products and how they were becoming very popular in schools, and started doing some reporting just based on, what are the problems that could follow from using e-cigarettes? What treatment is there for young people who get addicted? Like some of those sort of health and science angles. But as I kept covering the company, I just felt like there were so many other things that I wanted to talk about, from the regulation and the business angle and kind of the people involved. And that's what led me to writing the book, just to kind of get all of that into one narrative.
And there are so many angles to the story, public policy, the health of individuals, the rise of this company, the science of it all, the fate of JUUL itself, facing a lot of litigation, questions from the FDA, and we can go on and on. I think I wanted to start with what seems like one of the central issues and biggest controversies about JUUL, and maybe you can work into this a little bit of just the background of what is JUUL and how did it become the largest or quickest company ever to get to $10 billion in value as it did. And that question is, did JUUL target children and young people as customers, as we now understand big tobacco a generation earlier targeted children to get them hooked on cigarettes for essentially for profits, for the sale of their product?
You are asking the $1,000,000 question. So let me start with the background piece, and then I'll get to that question. But for those who don't know, e-cigarettes were created essentially to be a better alternative to cigarettes that hopefully does not kill you if you use them. So whereas a cigarette, you actually light on fire and inhale what results. An e-cigarette just warms a nicotine mixture, but does not create what's called combustion, that process of actually lighting it on fire. And the thought is that this comes with fewer health risks, produces fewer carcinogens, hopefully doesn't lead to cancer and any number of other diseases associated with smoking. So JUUL was introduced in 2015, looked really different than a lot of e-cigarettes that came before. It looks like a little flash drive. It's very sleek. It's very easy to use, kind of sophisticated, and it looks like an Apple product. That's the comparison that gets thrown around a lot. So on some level, that's good because it appealed to adult smokers who might actually be compelled to put down combustible cigarettes and use this device instead. But what quickly became apparent is that it also appealed to a lot of teenagers, and it really started to take off in schools. And kids who had never smoked a cigarette in their life were all of a sudden JUULing in the back of a classroom and blowing vapor into their backpack so their teacher didn't notice. So that sets up the second half of your question, which is, was that on purpose? I have not found any conclusive proof that it was. It seems, from speaking to people who worked at the company and reviewing documents and all of this, it seems more like things kind of spun out of control, and what was founded by two smokers actually started the company because they understood the need for this product. So what was started by people who wanted to help adult smokers just kind of spiraled out of control and ended up in the wrong hands. And people at the company maybe didn't understand what would be necessary to prevent that from happening, and made some dubious decisions in the way that they marketed the product, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I guess my long answer to your short question is that it was not intentional from what I've been able to find, but it was sort of mismanaged, and the way the company was run allowed this to happen in a way that it didn't have to.
And when you say you don't think it was intentional, do you mean sort of from the beginning? In other words, they started with a good intention to come up with a safer alternative to cigarettes, prompted in part by their own experience as smokers, and not with the intention of, or certainly not with the singular intention of appealing to children.
Right. I don't think anyone at JUUL ever sat down and said, hey, if we get kids addicted to this, it's going to make us a ton of money. I don't think that ever happened from everything I've been able to tell. Mm-hmm. What I do think happened is people at the company realized that the look of this product and the fact that it was so much cooler and better looking than products that came first, I think they realized that that could be a real selling point. And so when they started to market it, they focused very much on playing up that it was cool and playing up that, young, attractive, and by young, I mean people in their 20s and 30s, not teenagers, that the young people might want to use it. And so they designed like social media friendly ads that were colorful and youthful and kind of not how you would think an addictive nicotine product would be sold to adult smokers. So I think that is where a lot of people draw the conclusion that they meant to hook young people. But in my view, it's more that they didn't think it through and they were a little negligent in the way they designed that advertising, but it wasn't necessarily designed with the express intent to hook young people.
Right. And not to overly bring in legalistic language to the conversation, but even in non-formal legal settings, we know there are different levels of intention. I mean, you can just be careless, you can have full intention. Even when we talk about homicide, there are different levels of consciousness about
Sure.
actions. So, I mean, that can be, I guess, debated and probably will be decided in a more formal sense as we go through the legal process. But to, maybe we need to zoom out a little bit, because it's not just the big question about JUUL. It's within the context of decades and decades of dealing with the public health consequences of smoking, that the issue of the impact on children becomes so important, right? Because not too long before JUUL emerges, you have this massive settlement by all the major tobacco companies, with attorneys general from states all across the country. And it seems like the first big blow to big tobacco that opened the door to what becomes this monster settlement was concerns about big tobacco marketing to kids. It's the Marlboro Man is one thing, but Joe Cool is something very different. Talk about that a little bit and how that plays into the JUUL story.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that sets the scene for a lot of the concern about e-cigarettes, just that, there had been documents published not too long before e-cigarette companies began emerging that just clearly showed that cigarette companies were purposely hooking teenagers because they knew that they would use the products for years to come and make them a lot of money. And there's this, tobacco historians have kept preserved cigarette ads that when you look at them now, sort of through 2021 eyes, you just can't believe that they were ever allowed to exist because they're so blatantly appealing to young people. So then when JUUL comes on the market and has these really flashy, really fun advertisements, I think a lot of people who are knowledgeable about tobacco just said, oh my God, history is repeating itself. Here's this company that is not regulated by the FDA in the same way that cigarettes are. They can pretty much advertise however they want, and they're just doing exactly what cigarette companies did. And teenagers are going to get addicted, and we need to do something about this. And the other interesting thing to note is that when the two founders met at Stanford Graduate School and started putting together the idea for this company, they actually studied all those tobacco industry documents because they wanted to understand the landscape they were entering and, depending on who you believe, either how to run or how to not run a company. Mm-hmm. And so it's pretty clear that they had studied these ads from tobacco companies and knew what they looked like and knew who they'd been targeted towards. And so then when they came out with ads that many people perceived as similar, it looked malicious. It looked like they had realized, this worked for tobacco. Why can't it work for us?
Well, and you also talk in the book about how they both, the founders of JUUL, came from a product design background. I mean, it's an exquisite product when you think about it. I mean, cigarettes have pretty much had the same design, for a couple of centuries now, but this was really an innovation. And I mean, you mentioned it looked like a flash drive, and so it's small enough to stick in a laptop carrying bag. And there definitely been news reports and probably even your own reporting for Time Magazine about, a kid in a classroom dropping their JUUL and the teacher coming over and picking it up off the floor and handing it back, because it looks just like a flash drive that all kids today, would have as just part of their pencil pack,
Right.
And because it's a vape product and not a combustion product, it doesn't have the smell either of a burning cigarette, right? And so, I mean, there were news reports of kids, and we're talking about middle school age kids, not just high school, really young kids, smoking in the bathroom, but also smoking in class, because it doesn't have a cigarette smell to it, and they can do that. Those were all parts of the design of the product, right?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because depending on who you talk to, all of the things you just listed are either proof that JUUL was out to get kids addicted or signs that this product could have worked for smokers, because they do both. They kind of go both ways. I mean, on some level, you need a product that's small and subtle and discreet if you want someone who's trying to quit cigarettes to be able to kind of slip out and easily use this product throughout the day without smelling like smoke and all these things. And you want them to be able to carry it in their pocket, and all of that makes sense. But on the flip side, yeah, it was really easy for kids to conceal these products or to use them in plain sight because adults didn't know what they were for years. You mentioned kids dropping them on the floor and teachers picking them up. There was actually a school that banned flash drives because teachers could not tell the difference between JUULs and flash drives. And it just became such an issue that they just said, we don't want either in our school. Right. So it's really interesting because, yes, if everything had gone well, I think we would look at JUUL and say, what a brilliantly designed product. But because things went so wrong, all of these things were just double-edged swords that made the company's product that much easier for underage kids to use it.
Right. Well, and one of the other, I guess, controversial aspects of JUUL, which again, like you said, could either be seen as a very good thing, a smart marketing, a smart aspect of the company's marketing, is a business after all, and a very distinguishing characteristic compared to cigarettes is the flavors of JUUL, right? So you have a little device that is the vape itself, and then you have pods of nicotine product that get put into the device and heat up, and that's how it generates the vape, and that can be flavored. I mean, a cigarette is basically, I guess, either a regular flavor or maybe menthol, I guess, which was also part of Big Tobacco's campaign to make cigarettes more attractive to certain demographic groups. But in the case of JUUL, right, you've got a lot of, I always wondered what adult would be interested in creme brulee JUUL pods or raspberry sorbet or whatever they were. It does, or bubble gum. I mean, it does seem like some of the design in terms of the flavorings seems to conflict with the message that, hey, we're not really targeting young people.
Yeah, I mean, I keep saying over and over, it depends who you ask, but it really does. I mean, on almost all of these points, there are people who take both sides of the issue. Almost everyone who opposes the use of e-cigarettes thinks that flavors are more appealing to children and thinks they should be banned for that reason. But there are also a number of adult smokers and advocates for smoking cessation efforts who say, well, you also want to give adults something that tastes better so that they're more likely to use this instead of a tobacco cigarette. JUUL, I will say, to their credit, did not make most of the really kind of egregiously flavored products like Gummy Bear and Skittles. Like, they never got into that. There are absolutely companies out there that make flavors that kind of make you shake your head and wonder why they thought it was a good idea. The FDA has actually cracked down on things that were marketed to look like candy or look like juice boxes. And those things I think are hard to defend. But for, things like let's say, I don't know, a strawberry flavor, I think that falls into a little bit more of a gray area.
So, I mean, you come from a health and science background and come to the JUUL story from that background, at least initially. I want to talk about that too, because it does seem to me in this country we have a way that businesses that deal in at least potentially dangerous products, whether it's a chemical or or consumer product or a toy, or whatever it might be, because of the way the FDA and the law in this country regarding new products that companies might want to develop and put into the marketplace, way FDA works, it's put something into the market first, and if it turns out it's dangerous or causes harm, then we'll take action to remove it or limit it or regulate it. There were concerns in the early development years of JUUL about had they done enough research on the health effects? Had they done enough research to understand, was this really safer than cigarettes, which was the kind of key motivation and the key claim about JUUL? Talk about that a little bit, because I think that, that seems like such an important part of the JUUL story too. And I know you talk about that at length in your book.
Yeah, I think one of the more shocking aspects to this story for people who don't follow the vaping world closely, which most people don't, is that these products still to this day are not FDA approved. They've been on the market in some cases for longer than a decade, and the FDA obviously knows they're there and has just kind of decided not to do anything about it, but they're not approved. And I think that's sort of shocking to people who assume that if you can go to a convenience store and buy a product that somebody has weighed in and said this is safe to inhale into your lungs. And in fact, that's not always true. So JUUL and other makers have now filed applications for FDA approval, and the agency should be deciding what to do with those within the next few months. But the decisions aren't out. So as of now, it's still a huge area of debate whether these products actually are safer than cigarettes or not. Once again, scientists think different things, but the way I have interpreted the research in years of reading these studies is that, I mean, to state the obvious, you should be breathing fresh air into your lungs before you inhale anything. Like, if you don't smoke, you shouldn't vape. That's very straightforward. But I do think for people who are currently smoking, what the research suggests is that e-cigarettes are safer. They generate, or less dangerous, I should say. They generate fewer carcinogens and toxins versus what we know is in a cigarette. They seem to, while they're not good for your lungs, produce less damage to the lungs. The big caveat, though, is that these are new products. They haven't been sold for that long. And while we know a bit about the short-term effects, no one knows what they do to the body if you use it for decades, because they just haven't been around for decades. So I guess if I were advising somebody who smokes about whether they should use a JUUL or another e-cigarette, I'd say yes, if you can switch completely to that e-cigarette and not smoke e-cigarettes or not smoke regular cigarettes on the side, and use it for as short a time as you can, because we don't know what it does if you use it for years on end.
And if you don't smoke at all, don't start. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
I mean, tell me if this is just outside the scope of what you've looked at, but I mean, why do you think it makes sense to me that the FDA wouldn't have taken action 10 years ago, because there wasn't a body of science to work with to even look at health effects. To do that, you'd have to devise studies and have them out over a period of time and see what the health effects are. And so, I mean, you'd have to design all that and then do all that work. Something that does happen routinely with new pharmaceutical products, you would never have a new blood pressure drug, or, I mean, there's now in the news talk about a new Alzheimer's drug. And how that could be such a game changer for that disease. But you would never have a company say, we have a great new Alzheimer's drug, and we're just going to put it out there and see if in fact it works as well as we think it does. That would never fly.
Right.
You get approval. You have to demonstrate with the science backs it up. And if there's any tick in the results, they're going to withhold approval. So why do you think it is that when it comes to non-pharmaceutical products like a vape device or an e-cigarette device, we don't follow that type of practice in our regulations?
Well, the FDA didn't have any power to regulate tobacco until 2009. And when they got that power, e-cigarettes were starting to kind of trickle out, but they were not mainstream. I mean, not a lot of people used them. They were just starting to be a thing. And from what I learned from sources, it seems like the FDA basically said, we don't know what these are, and we don't think they're going to end up being a big deal. So we're not, rushing to regulate them. And then by the time it became clear that actually a lot of people were using these products and companies were proliferating, they were sort of flat-footed and they had to work overtime to draft a rule that arguably should have been on the books before any of the products were available. And the FDA doesn't move fast. I mean, the federal government generally doesn't move fast. So from the time that they realized we need to regulate this to the time that they actually got a final rule together, it was a process of years, and the industry just kept growing and growing and growing. So I think why they view these products differently than drugs, I don't know. But I think it's just an example of sort of how out of step I think federal regulators are with the pace that new products come onto the market today. I mean, it's not good enough, in my opinion, to see something's out and then 4 years later issue a rule. I just think, I don't know what the answer is, but there needs to be a way to compress that rulemaking process so that you're keeping pace with what people can actually buy.
Right. Okay. And I want to look ahead too, but before that, there's one other characteristic of the JUUL story that I wanted to ask about, because it's something I heard about a lot, having kids of a certain age, which is, not only did JUUL have just meteoric success in terms of dollars, revenues, in terms of, penetrating the marketplace and really dominating the e-cigarette marketplace. But, the number of middle school and high school kids who when surveyed said that they had used JUUL. But then also this part, and this is what I wanted to ask about, because what I heard too was not just kids using JUUL, but dealing JUUL, which is how it actually was described to me. There are kids who would buy the pods in bulk, and then they were reselling them in school to their friends in the way that you would, that you deal weed or pills or something else. How did you find that playing into the story in terms of, I don't know, perhaps the company's awareness of that, steps to try to curtail that kind of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely was happening before the pandemic and probably is still happening now. And the company is aware of that. I mean, they could see, there's one example in the book where one particular person kept claiming through the warranty program that his device was broken, and he'd mail or ask for another one. And I keep saying they, I don't actually know the gender of the person, but they did this like hundreds of times with different email addresses. So that was a pretty clear signal that people are just trying to amass a huge collection of pods and devices that they can then resell. And this seemed to be a particular problem on college campuses and at high schools where, maybe some people are legally able to buy it, but others aren't. So then there's this huge resale market. And there are pretty early indications that this was happening. The product launched in 2015, as I said, and pretty shortly after that, the company started to get calls to their customer service line where pretty clearly underage people were calling and asking how they could get it. And people were just buying large quantities that were pretty clearly intended for resale. So I think that's a huge problem, and it's something that now schools are aware of because this has become such an issue. But back in 2016, 2017, when a lot of adults didn't know what JUUL was, I'm sure a ton of that went on behind closed doors, and the schools just had no idea. So yeah, it truly took on like a culture of its own in a lot of schools where you knew what the good flavors were and that's what kids would buy. And creme brulee was not one of the good flavors. So nobody would buy it. And it just was truly a cultural phenomenon in a lot of places.
Okay. Well, and I want to ask you about kind of where do you see this story going? You mentioned the FDA is now looking at it. There's a lot of litigation in courts right now against JUUL. I guess first in terms of the health and science part of it, is there more research now being done, whether by the company or by independent third party interests to really try to get at the question of, even if it's not as dangerous as smoking cigarettes, what are the health effects? I mean, I've heard things like the heating process of a JUUL could generate formaldehyde, for example. That's a carcinogen. So what, I guess, what's the state and where do you see the future in terms of research into the health effects of e-cigarettes?
So with the FDA application process, essentially what each company is trying to prove is that their product has, quote unquote, a net benefit to public health. So essentially that the products are better enough for adult smokers to outweigh any health risks that they do introduce, whether it's carcinogen exposure or lung damage or whatever it is, and the use of the products by people who weren't previously smoking, so new addiction. And I think based on what the outcome is with the FDA application process, we'll have a lot more just information to work with. Because each company, the FDA application process is extremely labor intensive. They had to submit just thousands of pages of research. So once the FDA has combed through all of that and made a decision, I think that will make it a lot easier to make some of these assessments, because I mean, yeah, there are studies that say e-cigarettes contain way fewer carcinogens and they can help adult smokers stop using cigarettes. But then there are some that suggest, heart damage and lung damage, and potentially DNA changes. And it's really hard for the average person, or even a scientist, I think, to wade through all of that and decide what it all means. So I think once the FDA makes that ruling, it will bring some clarity to the space.
Jamie, what are some other changes you see? We've seen some changes, for example, in state laws on the legal age for any tobacco product. It seems like the timing of some of those state law changes going from 18 or 19 to 21, meaning raising the age,
Mm-hmm.
a response, at least in part, to the JUUL phenomenon. I don't know if you looked in the legislative history of some of those, you'd see direct evidence of that, but it's certainly the timing of it seems to make it closely related. Do you think we'll see more of that is in response, and what other kinds of, I guess, policy changes or public or government reaction do you think we could see in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think a lot of those changes, both in raising the purchase age to 21 and in banning many flavored products, a lot of that came in response to the JUUL phenomenon and that lung disease outbreak, which you might remember from 2019. Really dramatic. A lot of teenagers had just very serious lung damage. Some needed transplants, some were hospitalized for weeks, just a really scary time, which ultimately was linked to illicit THC products, not nicotine products like JUUL. But I think the combination of just the huge number of teenagers who were vaping and that outbreak really made lawmakers kind of sit up and say, we need to do something about this. And so the raise in purchase age was a big one, but also the FDA in early 2020 banned like flavored pods for JUUL products and anything but menthol and tobacco flavors in an effort to have them not appeal to kids. And I think we might see more actions along those lines moving forward, because while that policy applied to products like JUUL, where you have the device and then you have a little pod that you load into it, it didn't apply to disposable products, which are kind of single piece, one and done e-cigarettes. And those are still available in a huge range of flavors. They're popular with teenagers, they're cheap. And I think that is probably the next territory that the FDA is going to tackle, is getting flavors out of those as well.
Well, don't stockpile those disposables. Wow, well, so fascinating. And I've started reading the book. It's really, really good. I know this is your first book, so congratulations.
Thank you.
We'll definitely put a link to the book in the description for the episode, so people just have to click on it. No no Stanford-based product design needed. It's just a simple click and they can get to your book, which is called Big Vape, The Incendiary Rise of Juul. Jamie Ducharme, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It was great to meet you and really nice to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to meet you.